From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to the show. It's Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. So, we've been doing this show for almost 5 years now, and far and away our most visited topic on this show has been education. But I'm pretty sure I don't remember there ever being a week quite like this one. Our new, kinder, gentler mayor pushed out 4 of his own CPS board appointees and replaced them with 4 new appointees as he tries to get Soup's Academy into the rearview mirror. His personally selected CEO, Barbara Byrd Bennett, accepted reality and understood that she was so compromised she was never going to return to her job, so she quit. Contract negotiations with the CTU appear, at least in public anyway, to be going nowhere since the mayor's team suggested the teachers ought to take what's effectively a 7% pay cut. So there's a deadline in a couple of weeks for paying something like $670 million into the pension fund, and the city just plain doesn't have it, doesn't have any idea how they're going to get it. Charter schools are trying to expand their markets because that's what private enterprises need to do, but they're finding that lots of people in lots of neighborhoods are saying no thank you. And there's a controversial contract for cleaning the schools that's going so badly that it alone would have been the lead story on the show today if none of this other stuff was going on. And now we have a new story being developed over at WBEZ by Becky Vevea and her colleagues, looking into one of the few bright spots at CPS. We all know about the rising graduation rates and the falling dropout rates, but it looks like that old adage that if it looks too good to be true, it just might be too good to be true. So we're very happy to have Becky on the show today. Becky Vevea, glad to have you here. It's nice to have you back, and we have a lot to talk about. And of course, our old friend Thom Clark from Community Media Workshop, now UIC, teaching some courses over at UIC, yes. I understand. And of course, he can be heard every Saturday morning on Live from the Heartland over on WLUW Radio and online, everywhere, anywhere, all the time, as all of us are. So we can waste no time whatsoever. We got to get on to all of this.
I have a news flash, Ken.
You do?
Yeah, the mayor announced a new Kickstarter plan this morning to close that pension deficit. He's going to try to raise $599 million. Is
that right?
By the end of June.
By the end of June?
Yes.
I'll put $50 in. I mean, I think it's a worthwhile cause.
Well, he's already called up some of his friends, and they're ready to kick in, but they think they need a marketing plan first.
Yeah.
And so the first money is going to go into marketing.
Yes. That's going to be $100 million just for that alone, right? But he doesn't need Kickstarter. He's got Ken Griffin. Why didn't he just call him?
Well, that's who he called first.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's a Ken Griffin Kickstarter.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, Becky, let's get serious here for just a moment. For more than a moment. Graduation rates. The graduation rates, every time the mayor talks about his accomplishments, he talks about how the graduation rates are through the roof, and it really does look pretty cool. There's dropout is going down, graduation is going up.
Right.
But then there's these damn reporters who get in the way.
Yeah, so I've been investigating this with Sarah Karp, Catalyst Chicago, now BGA. We did a series of stories in February on the role that alternative schools are playing in those rising graduation rates. We found that they were having a 4% percentage point impact on the most recent numbers, and going backwards, they've been counting those graduates since about 2007. And with the mayor's expansion of alternative schools, of course, you're going to get more graduates out of those alternative schools. You're going to get more graduates overall, and they're all going to count in the same number. And so we have been following that story ever since we started on the alternative school string, and we're coming out with a story next week that looks at something we slowly started to find in the difference between what's like the original group of freshmen they count from and they do something where they adjust the group of freshmen that become that denominator. And we've found, you may remember the IG report from this year isolated out a high school that was coding dropouts who were going to a GED program as having moved to Mexico, and that moves them out of the denominator. We have found that is not a single high school problem, that it is a widespread problem, and that there are high schools all across the city that are, for whatever reason, miscoding dropouts, and those kids are basically disappearing from that calculation.
And before we get too far down this road, I think it's important to point out that, I don't know if this is a change or what, but if I run high school A and a kid drops out and then goes to an alternative school and gets his whatever that is,
Online
kind of
GED,
whatever it is, just sitting in front of a computer,
Right.
I get credit for his graduation.
Right, and that's always been the case because a long time ago, Chicago actually did something which made its graduation rate, frankly, look worse than like the state says it is, which is we want to hold you accountable for your freshmen. How many freshmen get across your stage within 5 years? And they weren't allowing them to count kids who transferred in, say sophomore, junior, or senior year, because that frankly would boost it, but would really only give us a snapshot of how many seniors you were graduating. So they said, we want to hold you accountable for your freshmen and moving them through. Well, as choice has expanded and as these alternative schools have expanded, they are counting those graduates back at the normal high school, which, I think people can debate and talk all day about whether or not they should be counting them. Now, some alternative schools do provide, an 8-hour curriculum with an actual high school diploma, same number of credits, and that was the argument to count them back in. But we've got some newer models that, kids only have to go for 3 hours a day. And frankly, like this story that's coming out next week, if it's not one of those high school diploma programs and it is truly a GED program, those students should be counted as dropouts. And they're not they're being masked as verified transfers. And there's nothing verified about them, frankly.
I see this as kind of statistical gerrymandering. It's similar to the homicide rate, which you've also covered on this show, where if you reclassify an apparent murder to something else, well, then your murder rate drops. Well, if you reclassify a student differently than what common sense might indicate you should classify them, if you're really trying to track real bodies going through a system, it may be the same thing as going on here, that we can't trust what the graduation rate is because the premise on which it's based is caught up in statistical gerrymandering.
And we had a very long conversation with CPS officials yesterday about this. And I should say, even, one of the things we've done when we've looked at all of our FOIA data and tried to kind of say, okay, well, let's remove the kid or put the kids back in that should be in and remove the kids that, went to GED or whatnot. And it still ticks upward. It's just not this like crazy exponential growth you see in the last 3 years. You see what you see in the state data, which again, the state data does a little bit differently, but you see this basically, it's like much smaller incremental progress. And so one of the things we're trying to also make clear is like there is improvement happening, and there are high schools all across the city that aren't doing this, but there are a lot that are, and I think it's driven, frankly, by a lot of the pressure that schools that's placed on schools to make these numbers look better.
Right, because it's
what that does really is by disappearing these kids out of that calculation, that may make your numbers look better, but then my question is what happens to those kids? If they're never classified as a dropout, how do these new re-engagement centers know to go after them? They don't. They may not. I mean, they of course have different techniques, but
and if
that's the sad part, I think.
If you wanted to look at it just purely, you would say, okay, in 2010, this number of people entered the system into high schools. It's now 2015. How many of them have graduated? I mean, but there are much fancier ways of looking at the numbers, and it always comes down, and it always has, and it always will. It always comes down to how will it look in the next press release, because that's all we care about is the press release. So there you have it. That's what you do. We must, I think we're required by law to talk about this shakeup at the board. It looks so draconian. It looks like the mayor, the blue sweater mayor has decided that he needs to be more with the people, and he's pulled some of these bad actors off the board and put better people on. But of course, as Catalyst and you guys too have said, you look at them, these are almost like completely replaceable parts.
Well, and he hasn't actually really explained much of how he picked them.
He doesn't need to.
And
right?
so-
He's not required to.
No, but you would
or
think
who
that
picked
he would,
them.
right,
Right.
or who picked them, or
Right.
what was the process? Did he consult anyone? I mean, I sent a list of questions to his office that basically asked those things, and I have gotten nothing back.
Mm-hmm.
And I should also say, and I give a lot of kudos to the Sun-Times for breaking the story, but all of the education reporters, and I imagine other reporters in general, were asking that question on Monday after Barbara's resignation, and we got silence.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I guess it's we haven't been, it hasn't been explained to us, and therefore I don't think it's really been of course it hasn't
Yeah.
really been explained to the public.
I was at the First Tuesdays thing with Ben Jarofsky and Mick Dumke the other night, and they had Karen Lewis on. And Karen Lewis said, yes, things have changed. I'm actually getting calls now from the mayor. He calls me quite often. In fact, I talked to him just yesterday. He called me to give me the heads up that he was going to make changes at the board. And I said, well, thanks for that. It would be nice if you were calling me to ask me
Advice
if I had an
on who to
opinion, right, to make some recommendations. But, you know, it's an improvement just that he's giving people 12 hours
These
notice.
seem to be all fine folks, and we thank them for their volunteer efforts, but they were kind of interchangeable parts, and I think they were picked to be yes votes, because that's who the mayor wants on his board. At least one of the people who was dismissed was not a guaranteed yes vote, a respected educator, Carlos Escocia, who's been in the system a long time, principal, then downtown, then back to being a principal.
Now, he was added more recently, right? He has not been on the board for the whole first term.
He was appointed to replace Rod Sierra.
That's right.
in
He was Rod Sierra's
November of
replacement.
2012.
Right. So you're saying he wasn't as reliable as he needed to be?
From the mayor's point of view, because he wasn't an automatic yes. He was a studied professional educator who tended to look at issues presented to the board and didn't always vote lockstep with the rest of the board as Fifth Floor was telling the board to go.
So now he's been replaced by another principal, right? He's been replaced by Gail Ward, who was the founding principal of Walter Payton High School, as I understand it, and then went on to work in the central office. So, I mean, does it do her a disservice to imply that maybe she was put on because she's going to be a more reliable vote? I mean, we have to be careful about stuff like that.
Well, it remains to be seen. And again, I thank her and others for their volunteer service, but I think for me as a taxpayer, an observer of the scene, the bigger issue is the widespread support for an elected school board, and this kind of decision this week, I think, drives that. I'm actually kind of neutral about whether or not the elected school board is the right way to go. I'm kind of in the camp that thinks maybe a hybrid system might be better, because these are wonderful folks that got picked, but I think we could do better.
Yeah.
And if it was a little more open process, that I know some people are afraid of becoming too political.
Yeah.
Well, it's awfully political now.
Yeah.
There's one guy in Fifth Floor making the decisions. And I think given what the education system faces in this city, we need to open that up a little bit more.
Well, and that would require change to state law,
Yes.
and you could write the law. I've talked to people who have done, I talked to, I think it was Baltimore County Public Schools, about they just recently went to a hybrid board, and they can write in anything they want in those laws to say, you know, capping spending, you know, these are the kinds of, this is the process we want, and we don't want it to be ads on all the TV stations and millions of dollars and lobbyists and special interests.
But it's important to point out that it requires a change to state law, not the Constitution or anything like that. And we've seen how quickly state law can be changed when the people who want it changed can get it changed. It 18 hours or something, it can be done. So that's not really an obstacle.
Although the mayor's not had particularly good luck with his legislative agenda, which I thought would be otherwise, but that's probably for another show.
Yeah, it probably is. But I think that what you're saying when you say we think we could do better, I think that I would expand on that to say that many of these people who have served on the board and are serving now are probably excellent board members. But if they were in an environment where there was a free flow of discussion with people who had different views from theirs, we might all benefit from it. I mean, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think you're right on that, and I think there's also questions, and frankly, I'm a little surprised that there's not more of a conversation given the recent contracts that have gotten them into a lot of trouble. You know, I went back to the meeting in which the Soups contract was approved and just listened to any, you know, the board members actually, this board does ask a lot of questions at the end of the meeting. And listen to see how many questions, I think I counted 4 or 5 that were asked about this contract.
Oh, there actually were questions
right,
asked,
but 4 or 5. I feel like with a no bid contract, there should have been 20 or 30.
A no bid $20 million contract.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah.
So
yeah.
there's an interesting, I think given that there were these contracts that got them into trouble, I guess I'm a little surprised that the mayor's office isn't at least putting on some semblance of let's talk about this and make a better
We
plan.
do see that, I'm sorry, I just forgot his name, but the former president of Loyola.
Garanzini, I have it right here.
Oh, how can we do this?
Garanzini.
I have it here.
Michael
yeah,
Garanzini, right? Michael Garanzini, who really did preside over unbelievable growth of Loyola, and was by all accounts spectacularly successful in his job. So maybe that's a positive thing. Although of course he was not a public education guy. He was a parochial education guy.
But he did turn around a budget mess.
He certainly did,
amongst other things, and stemmed declining enrollment and did building. And so he is an interesting nominee to put in place.
Yeah, and another banker. We swapped out bankers. Now we have a former Harris Bank member of the board. So anyway, that's the big story that probably won't end up being a very big story at all in a week or two when they all take their places and everything is cemented back in place.
Well, what's interesting, Ken, I'm pretty sure the July meeting, that's typically when the budget gets approved. So unless they move that back to the August meeting, which would be a week before school opens, this new board that could be their first vote.
How'd you like to be one of those
Which would be really
folks?
interesting.
If it's not to take up proposed charter school relocations, which also got postponed.
Right, those will come back up, and you've done a lot of work.
And we have to talk about that. That's really important. There are at least, by my count anyway, at least 4 or 5 of these charter expansion efforts that seem to be getting some pushback from their communities. And I want to know, big picture, are we actually at a point now where we're seeing the pendulum swing here? Are we seeing actual public opposition to the siting of charter schools, or is it just that it's just a couple of isolated outlier incidents that all look the same?
I think when you get a U.S. Congresswoman and state reps signing a letter saying no to a very specific charter school expansion in 2 neighborhoods, with virtually every area alderman and state rep in agreement. And now we're bringing to the table this week up in the Rogers Park area 8 local school councils who have voted against expansion, voted against a 4th high school in Rogers Park. And that's really the issue, I think, behind why this charter thing is coming up some more. Now that the board budgets on a per pupil basis, if you have competing schools to give parents choice, someone's going to pay. And typically, historically, though the history is a kind of short term, the neighborhood school is the one that suffers enrollment issues and therefore budget issues when the new guy in town comes in, who typically has a fixed up building, some additional corporate support, independent fundraising, a lot more things, at least on the front end, to attract parents, like in my neighborhood, Uno did when they moved into the old St. Scholastica. I don't have to repeat the management issues a federal investigation has brought up about Uno. The second charter high school in Rogers Park is the Chicago Math and Science Academy, also under federal investigation. More further to activities in Ohio, but they're there, along with Sullivan High School, which is in everyone agrees, was a neighborhood school that had issues, but it's being turned around by a very dynamic principal, much in the same way that Senn High School, just to the south, has tremendously turned itself around with a variety of programs. And I think what parents are saying, realizing when their principals say, I don't have enough budget for program this year, I have to fire this teacher because our enrollment is down, they're saying, wait, what's going on here?
And I have to share that money with this new charter that's moving in down the
So
street.
the privately managed public school, some of whom operate as for-profits, using the same per pupil per diem that regular public schools have to live with, without ancillary corporate support or major fundraising things. There's another story out today about the amount of additional fundraising that's going on in about 50 schools now around the city. That's part of the reality of trying to make resources get stretched to deliver a effective educational program. In any event, there is in Rogers Park an effort on the part of community leaders and parents to say, to CPS, because it's not clear how these decisions get made anymore, that we think for a system that's so strapped for money, that closed 50 schools just 2 years ago because of overcapacity, we don't have a capacity issue in Rogers Park. A fourth high school will take away from the other 3 schools that are there, and we're very afraid of Sullivan, the neighborhood public school, losing significant enrollment such that it could get closed.
Is that fair, Becky? Is it fair to say that a school like Sullivan will, and not to pick on that one school, but in that situation, a school like Sullivan will suffer, will see its funding depreciated because there's a charter school opening up?
Well, I should say all schools will see their funding depreciated this year. And I should also say that this school was approved, and so it's going to draw students from somewhere. It's got a freshman class right now. The particular one that's wanting to move into to Uptown is a Noble Street High School that has a freshman class this year. It'll expand to sophomores, then juniors, then seniors, and so that campus has already been approved, and all we're just debating now is where we put it. And frankly, there is valid arguments because physical location by nature ends up being a marketing tool. You know, you walk by what's going on in that school, a parent might be interested in it and more interested in that new school than in the old Sullivan that's trying to, keep up its reputation, fix it. So there are valid arguments in that in terms of location, but they will draw students from somewhere. And I think one of the big questions brought about with this debate over these North Side proposals is CPS has completely stopped doing its facility planning at the same time that it's thinking about its new schools RFP process. They're sort of operating in isolation, and that is not efficient. It's not good for taxpayers. I reported a story about 2 weeks ago that looked at, or maybe it was only a week ago now, that looked at all of these empty buildings and what did it really make sense to say we're not going to put charters in them, especially for ones that we had already approved who are paying rent in private buildings. And if the goal was to really downsize or right size, wouldn't you think you would use the assets you have rather than let them sit empty and have to maintain them and then pay rent across the street?
I totally get that argument, and there's a good example of Trumbull, which sits at Foster and Western, a giant, beautiful, Art Deco school that's just empty. But the reason it's empty is because the school system made the argument that it didn't have capacity and didn't need it.
And they used the wrong equation because it was a special ed school that was purposely lower
that's another half-hour
But it
show.
speaks to the issue of no planning, which is my frustration as a taxpayer, and why the Say No to Noble is something that I think has picked up steam, to get back to your original question.
If I were the principal of, say, Amundsen or something, I would be sitting here and I'd be saying, give me that money, right? I'm already on a glide path that's going up. My school is getting better. Help me get better still. Don't.
Yes.
So there's not.
Well made.
I apologize.
Right, and so there's not facility planning to actually look at, because on the north side, these principals are speaking out because they're saying, look, we're trying to attract families because we have room in our buildings. We have tons of room in our buildings. We want families to stay in the city and use those buildings, use what's sitting here in the neighborhood, and the city isn't helping these charter schools they've already approved figure out, okay, maybe there's another location that in an area where there is a little more demand or some overcrowding that we could put them in.
There is a bigger story going on here, which is part of a national trend, which is this, public schools just don't work, and public school teachers are taught too much. We need to privatize. I mean, that's, to my mind, what's really going on here. Whether it's the 50 schools that were closed to eliminate overcapacity, you still have charter schools being approved. To my mind, that speaks to a different agenda really that's being carried out here, which is to move away from CPS, except as some kind of shell agency, and everything like New Orleans closed its last public school this week. It's all charters.
I think that somewhere along the line a few years ago, somebody figured out, hey, you could make money running schools. And it's kind of like the prison things, like privatize the prisons. Let's privatize the schools. Again, that's an opinion.
And I wonder too, you mentioned the North Side. I hadn't even made this connection, but UNO and CMSA are run by these two operators that have come under fire in recent years for some of their business practices, and maybe a lot of the pushback from the parents up there are like, look, we're fine with the public
Yeah,
schools.
right.
Like, we'll bet, the
Yeah,
teachers,
yeah.
we think they're good and they should be unionized, and that's fine.
Give us a minute as an update on this excellent reporting that you've been doing about the Sodexo contract, the Aramark contract.
Yeah, so
I don't know where to begin, but we got to keep it.
There aren't enough
very
janitors
short.
in the
There's
school.
basically
There aren't
enough
enough janitors,
We're
yes.
paying them
Okay,
pretty much.
thanks.
We're paying them actually at this point a little bit more than what it cost us to do it in the past. It's well over what they promised to do it at. Part of that was, as you've seen, because they underestimated the number of buildings that they have and the number of square footage by
you reported
quite
22
a few.
or something. And
Yeah.
they don't even know the count of their own buildings.
Right, and so we're that contract's at about, I think, $86 million, and they had promised to do it for 64.
So we're saving lots of money by doing this, right? And you all,
Yeah.
I mean, again, all the education reporters have these great stories of teachers having to clean bathrooms and stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with all of us doing our part, but
We'll see on that. I mean, I think we'll see on that contract.
Yeah,
We'll
okay.
see.
Tom, finish the show off for us. We got a couple of minutes. We got a minute and a half. Put this in the perspective of the whole mess that's going on in the state, which is what we had invited you on to talk about before all this stuff superseded.
Well, we have the longtime speaker playing his cards very close to the vest, and the governor apparently ready to launch an anti-Madigan advertising campaign. I'm not sure what either battling parties are up to in terms of trying to actually solve this fiscal mess. I do understand that there's been a new proposal put in the General Assembly this week. Who knows how these things are going to progress during the summer when supermajority votes have to be taken and all that, but there is an effort to put forward what, to my mind as a taxpayer, is a true effort at revenue reform short a constitutional amendment, which is in fact to raise, again, the flat rate, but also to make some adjustments in the way the earned income tax credit is being used.
Interesting.
So that we could bring some more progressivity into the system and probably some expansion of the sales tax to more services.
To services,
The money is there. Ronner doesn't want to authorize it and spend it, and Madigan doesn't want to give him any kind of credit. He just kind of wants to jam the governor. And as a result, the rest of us are just going to be hanging in the bleachers this summer waiting to see if stuff is going to be cut, like the governor is talking about cutting juvenile detention centers. He's going to go for the sob story stuff, it looks like, and of course the most vulnerable once again will take it on the chin. It's a mess.
It's a mess.
It's a bigger
isn't it?
mess,
Yeah.
I think, than any of us anticipated it would be.
Yeah,
And I can't believe the Sun-Times chortling over, this is why we elected this governor.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
we were supposed to have better management, and I don't see anything being managed better.
Yeah, well, this would not be what you would call management, and this idea that you have to
It's a
you have to
playground
give me
battle.
these business reforms before I'm willing to talk to you about anything else. It's sort of like it's that level of kind of like basic negotiation. It's like, come on, let's get beyond those things and let's talk about the big thing and then figure the other things out in the process. We ran out of time. I can't believe it. We did it again. So thank you. Becky, it's great to have you back on the
Yes.
show. I know you haven't been here for a while,
I
and
know.
you've been just doing some great work over at BEZ, and I just
Thank you.
I want to congratulate you and all your colleagues for that, and Sarah Karp, and good for her. And you too. You've been doing some great work, and I'm glad to
Thanks.
have you back. But you're here a lot, so we're always happy.
Good to be
happy
here
you.
again, Ken.
Thom Clark from the Chicago Media Community Media Workshop. I always do that. You, my friend, have been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You can watch us here anytime you want, but the real good thing is to go online, and then you can just have us with you in your pocket. Check us out on iTunes too, okay? I'm Ken Davis. We'll see you next week with yet another show right here on CAN TV. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye.